Lee Marvin spent his life playing men who stared danger in the eye without flinching, but the battle that followed him to his final days had nothing to do with guns, bar fights, or war stories. It lived quietly inside him. 6 names he never spoke in public, 6 men who carved deep scars into a man already molded by violence. And 3 days before he died, lying in a Tucson hospital bed, he decided he wasn't leaving this world with those names buried anymore. It happened on August 26th, 1987. The doctor delivered the news with the calm finality of someone used to these conversations. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. Days left. Maybe. Lee didn't react. He simply asked for a cigarette, much to the nurse's horror, and muttered that nothing could kill him faster now. His son Christopher sat nearby, flipping through a People magazine feature on Hollywood tough guys. When he read that Lee had mellowed with age, Lee snatched the magazine out of his hands and tore it in two. "Get me a tape recorder," he said. Christopher thought the morphine was talking, but when he came back, Lee had written 6 names onto his medical chart with a shaking hand. 6 men he called the real story. He pressed record, cleared his throat, and said, "My name is Lee Marvin. I played killers on screen and survived them off it. I never tried to ruin another man's name. They did that to me, and I'm done covering for them." The first name was Charles Bronson, the man Lee trusted briefly before realizing that trust was the most dangerous thing Bronson ever stole. They worked together on The Dirty Dozen in 1966. Bronson approached Lee the first week with an offer of solidarity, 2 real tough guys among these pretty boys. Lee wanted an ally after recent conflicts with John Wayne, so he accepted the handshake. But Bronson's quiet demeanor masked something colder. Little things began happening during takes. He drifted into Lee's frame, coughed through lines, threw elbows in scenes meant to be controlled. Then came the rumor, Bronson telling the assistant director that Lee was drinking heavily again, despite Lee being sober for months. The story spread quickly, and the British press grabbed it with both hands. Headlines labeled him unpredictable, unstable, past his prime. Lee confronted Bronson in his trailer. Bronson didn't bother denying anything. He just stared with those empty, unreadable eyes. That silence revealed the truth. Bronson's toughness wasn't depth, it was vacancy. Lee smashed Bronson's scotch bottle against the wall and warned him that lies were more dangerous than fists. Producers cleaned up the mess, paid off reporters, and even gave Bronson a raise for keeping the production steady. Years later, a crew member's journal surfaced, confirming Bronson fed gossip to tabloids. That was it for Lee. He refused every job offer that included Bronson's name for the rest of his career. Bronson died decades later, trapped in the silence he once used as a weapon. To Lee, the symmetry was grim and fitting. The second name was John Wayne, the legend built out of cardboard, as Lee privately called him. They clashed on The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance in 1962. Wayne arrived with spotless boots and a Hollywood hero's swagger. Lee stepped off a bus wearing the same clothes he'd traveled in for days, because that's how a drifter looked. Wayne saw Lee not as a co-star, but as an accessory meant to elevate him. When director John Ford introduced them to the crew, Wayne laughed at the idea of sharing a spotlight. That night in the motel bar, Wayne told Lee plainly, "This is my picture. You're here to make me look good." Lee fired back with a line Wayne never forgot. "You already look like an advertisement for hair dye." Wayne spent the next weeks undermining him, stepping into his light, interrupting takes, shifting scenes to favor himself. But the real betrayal came with a restaurant sequence that carried Lee's longest speech. Minutes before shooting, Ford handed Lee new pages. 6 pages of dialogue gone, transferred to Wayne. When Lee confronted him, Wayne claimed it was better for the picture. Lee responded by calling him by his real name, Marion. Then he laid out the difference between them. Lee carried shrapnel in his spine from Saipan. Wayne carried makeup powder and a stunt double. Production halted for hours to separate them. They didn't speak again, even during scenes. Hollywood later praised their on-screen tension. If only they knew. Years later, when Wayne wanted Lee to present him an award, Lee refused. Wayne died in 1979, and reporters asked Lee for a comment. He offered one line. He was exactly what America wanted him to be. They printed it as praise. It wasn't. The third name was Clint Eastwood, the man Lee called the Quiet Thief. In 1969, during Paint Your Wagon, Clint told Lee he had studied his performances in detail. Not admired, studied. Lee took it as flattery until Clint began wearing Lee's boots, copying his stance, even mimicking the rasp in Lee's voice. When Lee found Clint practicing his mannerisms in a mirror, Clint didn't deny it. "You can't copyright a personality," he said. Lee understood exactly what Clint was doing, taking the edges off the persona Lee built through real trauma and reshaping it into something cleaner, safer, easier to market. Hollywood loved it. When Dirty Harry came around, offered to Lee first, declined by him, Clint stepped in and used that same borrowed voice to become a myth. The last time they saw each other, Clint approached Lee with an outstretched hand and said, "I owe you a lot." Lee looked at the unscarred hand of a man who had crafted his image from shadows of someone else's reality and said, "Yes, you do." There was nothing else to add. The fourth name was Steve McQueen, the golden boy who represented something bigger than rivalry. He was the future, and Lee knew it. On The Great Escape, set in 1963, McQueen arrived with charisma sharp enough to cut through steel. At first, he treated Lee with admiration, asking questions about the war and listening like a student studying a master. But as McQueen's fame grew, his tone changed. A quote in Variety described Lee as yesterday's news, and McQueen as the new American man. When Lee confronted him, McQueen tried to brush it off as studio manipulation, but the crack in his voice betrayed him. Eventually, McQueen said the quiet part out loud. "You are old, Lee, and I'm what comes next." It wasn't said with cruelty, it was said with certainty, and that certainty hurt more than any insult. The rest of the shoot became a competition McQueen ensured he would win. He added more motorcycle stunts, tightened his shirts, sharpened his iconic squint, something Lee recognized uncomfortably as a polished variation of his own pre-fight stare. On the final night, they stood overlooking the mountains. McQueen asked, "No hard feelings, right?" Lee replied with a line McQueen never understood. "The future is just the past with better lighting." They never spoke again. The fifth name was James Coburn, the deepest wound because it came from the man Lee once called a brother. They met during the Magnificent Seven in 1960, and Lee taught Coburn everything he knew about commanding a scene. Coburn soaked up every lesson. Lee trusted him in a way he rarely trusted anyone. Then Coburn took a role meant for Lee. Then he tried to limit Lee's scenes on Hell Is for Heroes. Then Lee overheard him on the phone plotting to push him out entirely. When Coburn called Lee old news, something inside Lee finally broke. He hit Coburn once, hard enough to drop him. The studio fined Lee. The press vilified him. None of them knew the truth. Coburn later won an Oscar, while Lee watched the rise of a man who had used him as a stepping stone. And that was when Lee stopped believing in loyalty. He didn't mentor another actor again. 3 days after recording the tape, Lee Marvin died. His final word, according to the nurse, was "finally." No Hollywood stars attended his funeral. Flowers arrived from some of the men he named, but not a single handwritten note. For 37 years, the tape remained locked away until Lee's grandson turned 40, the same age Lee was when he realized Hollywood didn't reward honesty, only survival. The tape was his final attempt at truth in an industry built on reinvention. So what do these 6 names reveal? Maybe that Hollywood legions aren't built on friendship. They're built on rivalry, insecurity, betrayal, and the quiet fear of becoming irrelevant. Maybe Lee Marvin wasn't bitter, just honest. Or maybe he was another casualty in the endless war between image and reality. The tape ends, but the questions don't. Who deserved forgiveness? Who earned his hatred? And who was Lee Marvin in the end? A bitter man? A truth teller? or the last authentic tough guy in a town full of pretenders. The choice isn't his anymore, it's yours.